right. Good to be here. How are you guys doing? All good? Always good to be back in Lithuania. You know, I love the audience here because it's top-heavy. Everybody's at the front rows. Back home in Finland, everybody's at the back rows. I actually have to put beer on the front row, and then people slowly calm down and
who's up for beer?
A bit later. Today we're going to talk about very important legal matters. I personally think that legal is a part of startup life that's often overlooked by founders. They kind of drive into the product and all the stuff, and then they figure out 5 years later that they're actually screwed because they forgot to do all the proper legal stuff. Right? I know we've been there ourselves. When we founded our company, we forgot some small, simple things like a shareholders agreement. Or like we forgot that we could actually get €1,000 per employee for the government for free for the next 6 months, and we didn't do that either, which could have been averted if we only spoke to somebody. But anyways, I want to jump into the discussion here, right? And we had a brief chat yesterday with you guys. And one thing is, you know, that interests me is, how is it different to be a startup lawyer and dealing with startups versus being, you know, a normal lawyer?
Shall I take that one?
Yeah, that's a good one.
I confess that if I were just a lawyer, I'd probably slip my wrists because it can be pretty boring being a lawyer and just turning through documents and all of that. But I think one of the key things in working with not just startups but fast-growing technology companies is that more often than not, you're working alongside the entrepreneurs, and so it's a vicarious thrill, or I'm able to actually enjoy the success of the clients and help them from very early stages, from incorporation all the way up through their funding rounds and exit, and that's actually a lot of fun. And you know, yeah, I get to wear jeans occasionally instead of the suit.
Okay. Well, there's a huge difference between, you know, huge corporations and their demands and what they expect from a lawyer and this entrepreneurial culture, which Chris correctly said. It's still it is somewhat well, you have to get used to that style. And this is a very good style. No nonsense, clear answers now, not in a day or two, which is not a prerequisite when you deal with corporations. And so they need, you know, boards need lengthy legal opinions to cover their, you know, behinds and you know, behind lawyer letters and legal opinions. So this is not the case here. We have startups constantly calling up and saying, well, actually, you know, I need an answer in 1 hour or now better about complicated, for instance, consumer credit policy, Lithuanian bank, consumer credit cards, why it's different from SMS credits, and I want it now, and why wouldn't you tell that? And the Lithuanian bank, they don't know anything, and why you have to tell me now. So those requests are pretty frequent, and it scares it scares the lawyers, especially the ones who are used to, you know, comfortable. You have to.
How do you deal with that? You know, you get these startups, right, who demand an answer right away, right? Who don't like you wearing your expensive suits, right? Who want a lot of legal advice and can call you up at night.
And for free.
And for free, yes. They don't have any money. So how do you deal with that, and why?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just throw in the towel now. I'll go. No, I think you've got to understand that at least I'm originally from the States, but I'm based in London, and the whole concept of a startup lawyer or a lawyer who works with fast-growing companies originated in Silicon Valley, and there you've got this ecosystem of not just lawyers, but also the accountants and all of the professional service providers who work with the companies from the very early stages and go on that journey with the companies as they grow. And it's not just the rewarding emotionally or spiritually, but yes, you know, you are able to recover all of that investment that you've made at the early stages when you are giving essentially free legal advice, because hopefully, most of the people in this room, although you may have small companies now, in a few years that will be very large. I mean, a perfect example actually for my firm is a couple of my colleagues actually incorporated a little social networking company, and we continue to act for Facebook. And that's the sort of fast growth. Yes, and in fact, one of my colleagues is very good friends with Mark, and they hang out together, and that's part of the relationship that we develop with founders.
You mentioned again that it's good to start early on with these companies, right? And that it's good to provide them with some free legal advice. So let's do some of that now and provide some free legal advice to the people in the audience, which I think is always important in the panels. Try to get some value for the folks who is listening, right? So what are some of the things you think when starting up? Let's start with Lithuania first, right? You are here. You're starting up. You're building a company. What are the first things that people forget? What do they should really, from the legal matter, take care of when they're just starting out here?
Okay. So maybe I can start. I would say first of all, get your IP rights in order. So and these are actually there's a variety of issues here. Licenses and trademarks, well, or patents. That's just the beginning. But especially if you have a lot of people who have worked on the code so you have to clearly somehow bring everything into the company, into the entity that sort of is a startup. So there should be no doubts. Well, if your friend has coded at home during the weekend or during vacation, is that who did that? Is that him personally? Does he own the rights, or is it a company which owns? So all those all those issues have to be considered. Another issue is usually which is overlooked is. I would say share ownership, share sale. Versus a lot of startups, we've seen that like really making hundreds of thousands, millions of euros turnover. They come and say, well, actually, you know what? We decided to bring in the investor, but we had, I sold part of my shares to my friends, and then we now want to sort of take the investor, then we'll see. So we asked them to bring
and oh, by the way, I promised my friend 50% of my shares 2 years ago over a beer.
Yeah, that's true. And so they bring 2-year-old agreement, and you see that the shares were sold by the company, not him, using a US template. And you see, wow, how do we go back 2 years back and rectify that? And so this is also very important. This title of ownership to the shares that you own from the very beginning, so that will be clearly taken through the history, and investors are looking into that very, very clearly. Another issue is stock options and stock option plans. Here, yet again, a lot of templates are used from UK, US, which may have quite huge tax implications here. Unfortunately, still, despite what government says.
It's difficult here with options.
It is rather difficult, despite what the government says, that everything's clear and fine. Actually, they don't distinguish themselves between stock options and stocks that are not vested, and what's employee stocks. These are a dark matter for government. They say everything's fine, which is absolutely not.
The government's like the everything is fine, keep going motto everywhere. But what is it specifically that you guys think that the company should do, right? So, when it comes to code, is it something like they should track it somehow of whoever touched the code?
Sure. So, yeah, I think, fundamentally, following on from what Linus was saying, you really need to get your shit together, because if you don't do it now, it's going to be too late when you actually get financing or outside investors or anything like that. And we were talking earlier, Dropbox is your friend. Make sure that you've got all of the agreements that you've entered into. Just upload them into Dropbox on a regular basis, so you've got that. You don't need to sort it out now, but just make sure that you've got a central repository of all of the documents. With respect to code, it's absolutely fundamental that you do have that audit trail of who's actually touched your source code and things like that, because who knows, in 2 or 3 years, that person may no longer be with the company, and they may not have validly transferred the intellectual property rights to that code. I mean, we've had deals where, yes, somebody was involved in the source code of a company. The company was raising $5 million. But one of the developers had moved to Australia, and they had to track him down, get him to sign a piece of paper. And there's not exactly a lot of incentive to somebody in Australia signing a piece of paper for a company that he used to work for. So it's a real thing that if you need to get your stuff together sooner rather than later.
It might even bring, thoughts that maybe if they need my signature now, maybe there's a good deal. Maybe I should get part of it as well.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. Cool. There's nothing like a little bit of dollar signs in the eyes.
All right, we spoke about a bit briefly about the investment round. So a lot of the time, this is kind of the turning point, right? This is the time, the checkup point where everything does have to be in order and everything will be checked, right? So how do you prepare for the funding round, and how do you prepare for a funding round that's, let's say, outside of Lithuania? Because a lot of the companies that are here, they might get the seed funding here, but then anything more serious, very often it goes, for example, to the UK, right? So how do you prepare for that? What do you need to do? What are the steps you have to take?
Well, I think despite everything what we have said here, there will be definitely issues still left out, and so especially
and that's perfectly normal.
That's normal. So nobody's perfect. Even our documentations within the firm are not perfect, definitely. What I was trying to say in the deals that we were TransferGo, Trafi, which are recent examples of foreign investors coming into the company, and before Flip, what we recommended is we went through the documents before the funds lawyers started sniffing the documents and tried to cover up the most obvious things and sort of
what are the most obvious
not cover
things?
up, rectify.
Sorry, rectify and bring everything in order. Yeah, sorry. Yes, and so these were the issues I just told. IP rights were scattered all over the world. We had to bring that in order. Stock option plans, stock option agreements were done under nobody knows which templates, and then you have to sort of say how do we execute those, and do we execute before the flip? Do we cancel those out? And sort of issue new stock options under UK law, which is then more tax friendly, and so all those issues.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally all this goes down to or comes down to what any institutional investor is going to do when, as part of the investment process, they're going to do what's known as a due diligence investigation, and that is just poring over all of the documentation of the company. And you could that going back to my Dropbox example, that's your friend in terms of having all of that documentation ready for that investigation. And last year in London we did it was about 104 venture financings, nearly 390 worldwide. And in each one of those deals, there's a due diligence investigation. There's usually a virtual data room of some sort, whether it's on Dropbox or Google Drive or a fancy data room service. But in all of those, the investors will be reviewing the documentation to make sure that yes, they are comfortable in investing in the company based upon the valuation that's been agreed.
I just want to get a bit of a feeling for the audience that we have here, right? Yeah. So we talked yesterday about the cap table. So I just want to ask, who knows what a cap table is? Okay, very good. Now we know that every single legal term you just mentioned has to be explained, right? So maybe we can go back a little bit, right? And explain some of the things we've said, right? So, I mean, we talked about the cap table that I mentioned. Maybe we can explain what it is and why it's important to have it in order before you raise the funding.
Sure. So one thing that is absolutely fundamental to raising money is that you have to have a company. Because otherwise you're essentially just an employee of a third party. But if you're a founder of the company, then that is your company. And the fundamental question is, who are the other shareholders of your company? Is it just you? Is it you and your co-founders? Do you have other participants in the company? The cap table is the usually the list of who those shareholders are and the number of shares that they hold. Now, a common mistake is to simply put percentages next to everybody's names. And it doesn't require a mathematician to work out that those percentages will adjust when you bring in more shareholders. And so from one of the cleanup things that we often do is trying to clean up that cap table, because people claim to have, oh, well, he's got 15%, he's got 35%, and he's got 50%, and he's got 35%. And suddenly you have a company which is owned by people who own 150% of the company. And you can't own more than 100% of something. Sort of like, I don't know if anybody's familiar with a play or a movie called The Producers by Mel Brooks, but that's exactly the situation.
And what are some things that investors don't like to see in such a cap table? What are some pitfalls? I know, like giving,
one of the things is make sure that first off, that the co-founders actually own shares. And secondly, that you don't have one of the co-founders who's no longer involved with the company, who's on the beach somewhere, who owns a significant chunk of the company. Because clearly an investor isn't going to want to invest into a company where you have people who are no longer contributing to the company.
Okay, and moving on, like say going to the UK, that's what we discussed, right? So say a UK-based investment firm wants to invest into you, they very often want you to be based in the UK, right? So you as a company from Lithuania, what do, right? Do you immediately, as you found your company, think about having an entity in the UK right away, or do you do it at the time of transaction? How do you get ready for that?
Yeah, so it is a fact that most of investors have sort of a home bias, or like it, like the things that they know best, and the best they know, the companies they invest in their jurisdiction. So if it's a U.S. fund, usually it's a U.S. most of the time Delaware corporation. If it's a UK fund, they usually want a UK limited established so that they would invest in a familiar surroundings. And that's a very tricky question for a startup, Lithuanian startup. Do I give up everything? How do we transfer? And before the first flips like Traf and TransferGo, we worked through like 3-4 scenarios, various scenarios how we could execute that so that the whole property, intellectual property employees would end up under the UK company's control. But then out of those 5, you immediately could deduct 2 or 3, which would incur huge tax implications. Because the change of ownership in here in Lithuania from Lithuanian tax authority means always a sale. And so if you sell your shares, there's capital gain, meaning difference between your purchase of the shares, which is maybe founding authorized capital, just those 2,500 euros, and then you have investors suddenly who buys your shares for, I know, or not your shares, but the shares of a company for 5 million. There's a huge difference what one share is worth now, and so in order to avoid that, now that the founder still doesn't have any money because he doesn't get anything from the first rounds, everything flows into the company, not to him personally, but nevertheless there's a value attached to his shares already, and this value is well, the tax authorities love to tax everything. So even if you don't get anything, but sort of the shares have changed control, so meaning that you are not controlling that, but some UK entity control, means a sale. I don't know if I'm trying to be as plain as possible. I see from the eyes it's too complicated anyway. So Anyway, so the problem is taxes. So, but we found one or two ways how we could do that without tax implications, and that's rather simple. So you end up with a structure in UK entity which owns a Lithuanian entity. So nothing changes in Lithuania. Just instead of you shareholders, you get the shares of a UK company, and you proceed with on. And investors are most of the time they're happy that nothing has to be transferred from Lithuania except for those shares.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, the fundamental thing when doing this, what's known as the flip, from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, is that the operating company here in Lithuania still exists and will still be functioning. It wasn't just Trafi and TransferGo, but it was the same with Vinted and with GetJar. Although, unfortunately, I did the GetJar one, and that was before the change in legislation. So the tax issues there were a complete nightmare. But we'll forget about that one.
Okay, and what are some examples of what went wrong during these flips, right? What are some of the things you found? I mean, I think it's good to hear some stories, right, about what went wrong, what did the startups forget, what is it that usually goes wrong?
Well, I think the concept of the flip, as I was saying, is you do need to do it on a tax-efficient basis. The last thing that you want to do is have to pay tax as part of an investment. So you do need to get the proper legal advice and the structuring from the tax perspective. The worst case scenario is that, yes, you do have to pay tax. That does happen in other jurisdictions. I mean, there's only been a handful of flips here. But for instance, when we flipped companies from Germany to the US, we've had to come up with some very complex structures to minimize the tax, but there is still some tax payable, and you want to avoid that. But for instance, when we're flipping even companies from England to the US, we have to go through a process to ensure that there isn't a tax payable.
Another problem that we had, and in most of the cases, before you get an institutional investor in your fund, you most probably have some accelerators, some advisors who are experts and maybe have good network and could introduce you to people. And entrepreneurs quite often they give out maybe small percentages, but nevertheless some shares. And it's if you're very generous and you gave out to many people hoping that they will introduce you to everyone, it's a nightmare then to manage all those individuals sitting in New York, South Africa, London, New Zealand, Australia, so that they would make an effort for you, for your 1 or 2 shares that you gave, that they would agree on this flip as well. And so it was, I think we spend half of the time tracking those, and everybody is sort of lazy, deal with my lawyer, time differences, and and you need all the documents legalized and apostille, so all those issues. And they say, well, it costs more than my investment into all those formalities that you do. So that's than what I would get even after the flip. So that's a tricky one. That's a nice.
Is there a way to avoid the flip? Can you set up a company right away in the UK?
You can, but I think one of the great things about starting incorporating not just in Lithuania but in other jurisdictions is at the seed stage you do want to get support from local investors. You do want to have there's always the 3 Fs: the friends, fools, and family,
and local investors.
Sorry?
And local investors.
Well, yeah, in certain parts of the world, they fall under the category of fools. But, and let's be honest, that's going to be the easiest way that you're going to raise money from the 3 Fs. And therefore, that's going to be in your own local jurisdiction. It's going to be pretty difficult for you to, say, incorporate in England and expect immediately to raise money in London or even from your friends and family here in Lithuania.
What if you have a holding company that does nothing in the UK but just owns the Lithuanian entity from the start?
Yeah, you can do that, but then you almost have the tail wagging the dog. Because yes, you can set up that structure, but do you need that right now? I mean, one of the fundamental things about the flip, and what certainly happened with GetJar and with TransferGo, and although actually with TransferGo it was a little bit more complex, but certainly with Trafi is that those flips were done in the context of a financing, and so you can do a couple of rounds of local financing here, and then when you do get approached by that well-known VC firm in London or in the States, as part of that financing round, you can do the flip.
So flip is just a tool, and the problem is that local investors, all the funds that we have here, Practica Capital and others, they are not allowed to invest in UK. They are allowed only to invest in local entities. So that's one. Second, even if you set up a holding company in UK, there are quite a lot of instances when US investors require that it would be set up in US or flip to US, even from UK, which is sort of known jurisdiction. So it doesn't help you immediately. And
yeah, I think if anybody is considering doing a flip right now and following in the footsteps of the companies that we've mentioned, wait until you actually have that term sheet from the well-known venture capital firm in London or in the Valley. You don't need to do it right now, and you save yourself some money too.
And those funds will tell you where and what they want and how to do that.
Given that the audience is fairly new to this, as we kind of, at least based on one question, established, what are some things that they can do right now to really learn some basics, right? I mean, a lot of time they don't have the resources to hire a lawyer. What is it, some readings they can do, or some resource either in Lithuania, or in the UK that they can look up and really learn some stuff?
So Orrick has a huge database. Chris can tell us. We are developing that in Lithuanians, which might be which will be made available here in Lithuanian. Some simplest templates, so you wouldn't make the simplest tools, simplest mistakes. So that should be up. Maybe that would help, and how that we can contribute to the ecosystem here.
Yeah, I mean, Google's your friend when it comes to legal documentation, but don't rely on it 100%. That's actually where we make the most money as lawyers, trying to fix everything that's been done wrong. Instead, use Google, use the templates that are available to educate yourself about what you need to do. But I'm not suggesting that we're brain surgeons or anything like that, but do go to an expert who can actually advise you on how to do it correctly, because there's a lot of information regarding whether it's the stock option plans or IP assignment agreements or employment agreements and all that. But the cost of getting it wrong is significantly more than the cost of doing it right.
And we have also a startup academy set up here for entrepreneurs, and it's on Facebook. And we're starting with a series of seminars aimed directly at entrepreneurs, where we will be talking about stock options, 101 of stock options, data protection, data management, intellectual properties. And so
and sorry, just one last thing. If you Google Orrick and Startup Toolkit, my colleagues in the Valley have this amazing resource that was referred to earlier of all kinds of agreements that is free of charge. You can download them, and it provides a lot of good information and background for any company that's in the tech sector that's growing fast and needs access to that sort of information.
So we have just a few seconds left, right? Quick question, right? I know you're both excellent lawyers, but I have to ask you a question. How do these guys choose an excellent lawyer? If you just summarize it in 2 sentences, right? What do you look for? How do you find out if a lawyer is good or not if you have no legal background yourself and you have no clue?
I think it all comes down to referrals. Go to the founders and the entrepreneurs who've had the experience of working with lawyers and ask them, who would they recommend? Because you don't want to go in England. There's the reference to the high street lawyer. That's the lawyer who deals with trusts or who deals with wills and transferring property and stuff like that. I'm sure they're a great lawyer, but they're not the folks that have the experience and the expertise to advise companies and entrepreneurs. So go, ask around. We were referring earlier to the ecosystem. You've got to go to the people who have that experience.
I second that. Take a lawyer who has experience in those things, because last night we were talking with Intel Capital. There are so many jokes about taking a lawyer who doesn't understand what liquidation preference is and fighting it against it or down round, and it's a horrible thing for everyone at the table if they don't know the legal concepts behind the venture capital, which are so standard. I think it just makes the life difficult for everyone.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for all the advice.